The devastation of World War I left a profound mark on the world, not only in terms of politics, borders and society, but also on culture. The war shattered ideals, overturned beliefs, and disrupted the very fabric of the world that came before. As soldiers returned home to countries forever changed, the trauma they experienced found a powerful outlet in the arts, especially literature and art. The artists and writers of this era, often referred to as the lost generation, expressed the horror, disillusionment, and uncertainty they felt after the war in ways that would reshape culture for generations. For these men and women, war was no longer a noble pursuit or a righteous cause. The world they returned to was different, fractured, broken, and scarred. The once accepted beliefs of heroism, duty, and glory were now seen as empty, if not dangerous, ideals. What emerged from this cultural shift was a body of work that rejected traditional norms and sought to understand the new reality in which they lived. The works of these writers and artists are a testament to the emotional and psychological toll of the war. The war's aftermath was especially marked by a sense of hopelessness. The pre-war optimism that had existed in Europe, the belief in progress, civilization, and the idea of human improvement through science and reason, crumbled under the weight of the war's brutality. This cultural crisis gave rise to a new wave of art and literature that focused on disillusionment, loss, and the absurdity of life. Ernest Hemingway, one of the most famous authors of the Lost Generation, wrote extensively about his experiences as an ambulance driver on the Italian front. His sparse, minimalist style and themes of stoic endurance in the face of an indifferent world reflected the internal struggles many soldiers faced upon returning home. His most famous works, A Farewell to Arms and The Sun Also Rises, explored the emotional fallout from the war, particularly the sense of disillusionment and alienation many felt after the horrors they witnessed. Hemingway's writing resonated deeply with readers, capturing a universal sense of loss and longing. The poets of the Lost Generation also became voices of the wounded spirit. Writers like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon wrote some of the most powerful anti-war poetry ever created. Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est famously condemned the romanticism of war, highlighting the brutal, senseless deaths of soldiers. His words, "My friend, you would not tell with such high zest, to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, Dulce et Decorum Est, pro patria mori," rejected the idea that it was sweet and noble to die for one's country. Sassoon similarly used his poetry to criticize the war and its senselessness, addressing both the horrors of the battlefield and the way soldiers were treated when they returned home. Their work, often deeply personal, painted war not as a heroic or honorable endeavor, but as a tragedy that should never be repeated. Meanwhile, in the visual arts, the war's influence was equally profound. The brutal realities of battle, trenches, gas attacks, mutilation and death found their way into the works of artists like Otto Dix and George Gross. Both German artists served in the war, and their paintings and etchings were filled with grotesque depictions of the human body, reflecting the disfigurement and suffering they witnessed. Dix's The War 1924 is a harrowing portrayal of soldiers on the battlefield, their bodies broken, mangled, and destroyed by the violence of war. His work, like the poetry of Owen and Sassoon, aimed to capture the terrifying reality of conflict, rejecting any glorification of violence or heroism. The war's impact on art was also felt in the rise of movements like Dadaism, which emerged as a direct response to the senselessness of the war. Dada artists, many of whom had lived through the war, sought to break free from traditional artistic conventions. They embraced absurdity, chaos, and irrationality as a way to critique a world that had led to such widespread destruction. The works of Dada artists like Marcel Duchamp, who famously exhibited a urinal as art, challenged the very idea of what art could be, making a statement about the disillusionment and alienation felt by those who survived the war. In addition to Dada, Surrealism emerged as another reaction to the war. Artists like Salvador Dali and Max Ernst explored the unconscious mind and dreams, creating works that seemed to reflect the surreal, nightmarish quality of a world scarred by war. Surrealism's emphasis on the irrational and the subconscious was, in many ways, an attempt to understand the chaotic and inexplicable nature of the war's impact on the human psyche. The writers and artists of the Lost Generation were not simply creating works in response to a historical event, they were grappling with their own inner turmoil. For many, The war had stripped away any illusions they had about humanity, leaving them with a sense of isolation and loss. Their works were often deeply personal and reflective, as they sought to make sense of a world that no longer seemed recognizable or comprehensible. But the legacy of the lost generation is not one of complete despair. While their works reflected the trauma and hopelessness of the post-war world, they also offered a form of catharsis. By putting their pain, confusion and grief into art and literature, they created something enduring, works that would continue to resonate with generations of readers and viewers. Their contributions to literature and art challenged traditional notions of beauty, heroism and morality, paving the way for new forms of expression and understanding in the years that followed. In the decades after World War I, the works of the lost generation would continue to influence writers, artists and thinkers. The war's impact on art and literature would become a crucial part of the modernist movement, which sought to break away from the old ways of thinking and creating. The writers and artists of this period may have been lost in the sense that they were disillusioned and unsure of the future, but they were also pioneering new paths forward in a world that had been irrevocably changed by war. The lost generation may have witnessed the darkest aspects of human nature, but in doing so they gave the world a deeper understanding of the complexities of the human experience. Their works are a testament to the power of art, to not only reflect the world as it is, but to shape the way we think about it. Through their writings and paintings, the lost generation turned their trauma into a form of expression that continues to speak to us today, reminding us of the cost of war and the enduring need for peace. The lost generation's influence did not stop with their immediate works. As the decades passed, their contributions continued to shape the cultural landscape, paving the way for future generations of artists and writers to explore themes of alienation, identity, and the human condition. The emotional scars left by World War I were not something that could be easily healed, but the lost generation managed to channel that pain into a profound and lasting cultural impact. In literature, the post-war disillusionment that had characterized the lost generation continued to resonate in the works of later writers. Authors such as J.D. Salinger, William Faulkner, and Thomas Wolfe would draw on the themes of fragmentation, existential questioning, and the search for meaning in a chaotic world. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, for example, echoes the feelings of alienation and disillusionment that characterized the lost generation's works. Holden Caulfield's struggles with finding authenticity in a world that feels hollow mirrors the experiences of writers like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, who through their works had expressed a similar disillusionment with the world around them. In art, the spirit of the lost generation lived on in movements like abstract expressionism and the development of modernist painting. Artists such as Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko pushed the boundaries of what art could express, continuing the exploration of inner conflict and the emotional aftermath of war that was so prevalent in the works of World War I artists. The use of abstraction in these movements allowed artists to communicate psychological and emotional states that could not easily be depicted in traditional representational ways. What was unique about the lost generation was their collective response to a shared trauma. While each artist and writer had their own distinct style and approach, they were united in their desire to make sense of the chaos they had lived through. Their works rejected the optimism and idealism that had preceded the war, acknowledging that the world they had known was gone, replaced by something far more complex and uncertain. In doing so, they gave voice to a generation that had witnessed destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. The lost generation's legacy is not one of simple nostalgia for a time that no longer existed, but rather a recognition of the deep. The lost generation's legacy is not one of simple nostalgia for a time that no longer existed, but rather a recognition of the deep wounds the war had carved into the soul of the 20th century. Their work was both a product of its time and a timeless reflection on the human condition. They were witnesses to the collapse of certainty, and they responded with brutal honesty, deep introspection, and artistic rebellion. F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby is a prime example of this. While not directly about the war, its glitzy parties and hollow decadence portray a society trying desperately to forget. The American dream is shown to be a lie, corrupted by greed, disillusionment, and a sense of loss that runs just beneath the surface. It's a novel about emptiness, the emptiness left when meaning is stripped away, when belief is replaced by performance. Likewise, T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland painted a haunting picture of post-war Europe. Fragmented, bleak, and filled with references to broken mythologies, it captured the fractured spirit of an age. "I will show you fear in a handful of dust," Eliot writes, a line that speaks to the spiritual desolation felt across a continent still burying its dead and rebuilding its cities. In Paris and London, cafes and salons became the new battlefields, not of war, but of thought. Writers, painters and thinkers debated, drank, and created in an atmosphere thick with memory and defiance. Gertrude Stein, often called the godmother of modernism, hosted gatherings where people like Hemingway, Picasso, and Ezra Pound reshaped the creative world. These weren't merely artists, they were survivors attempting to translate trauma into truth. In Germany, the Weimar Republic saw an explosion of artistic experimentation, from the haunting realism of Otto Dix's war-torn canvases to the satirical, cutting-edge work of George Grosz. Expressionism, Dadaism, and later, Neuzeitlichkeit, new objectivity, all grew from the soil soaked in the blood of trench warfare. These were not just artistic movements, they were acts of resistance. Art became a mirror, sometimes cracked, sometimes distorted, reflecting a world that no longer trusted itself. For many veterans, writing became therapy. It was a way to process the unprocessable. Memoirs and autobiographies poured out of every corner of Europe and America. Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That is a scathing, sardonic reflection on both the war and the romantic lies that led young men into it. His tone is weary, his perspective sharpened by the loss of countless friends. Similarly, Vera Brittain's Testament of Youth chronicled the war from a woman's point of view, a nurse who saw firsthand the suffering and sacrifice, and who lost her brother, fiancé, and friends to the machine of war. Women writers like Brittain carved a vital space in the literature of the time, reminding the world that the impact of war extended far beyond the battlefield. Their stories highlighted the silent wars fought at home, wars of grief, loneliness, and endurance. They showed that courage isn't always a charge across no man's land. Sometimes, it's staying alive when everything you love has vanished. The long shadow of World War I extended well into World War II and beyond. The writers of the Lost Generation had set a tone, one of skepticism toward authority, deep questioning of societal values, and an unflinching look at suffering. George Orwell, whose early writing was influenced by the disillusionment of the interwar period, would go on to explore themes of control, truth, and the fragility of freedom in works like 1984 and Animal Farm. Even today, the ripples of the Lost Generation can be felt in modern art and literature. Their rejection of false optimism, their embrace of fragmented forms, and their deep moral questioning still resonate. Modern war literature, from Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried to contemporary reflections on Afghanistan and Iraq, owes a debt to the groundwork laid by those who came back from the trenches with pens in their hands and pain in their hearts. Ultimately, the Lost Generation taught the world how to grieve honestly. They didn't hide behind flags or slogans. They didn't pretend the war had made them better or nobler. They showed what it meant to lose faith, and what it meant to keep creating anyway. Through their stories, paintings and poetry, they turned horror into human connection, and in doing so, they ensured that the war they survived would not be forgotten. Their voices, often filled with sorrow, still echo in classrooms, galleries and libraries around the world, not because they glorified the past, but because they refused to let it be sanitized. They made sure the mud, the blood, the fear, and the heartbreak were remembered not as distant history, but as part of our collective soul. Their art was their rebellion, their literature, a lifeline, and their legacy, enduring proof that even in the face of immense loss humanity can still find a way to speak.